On the evening of February the 12th, 2019, a room full of NASA engineers did something no mission control had ever done before. They played a love song from 1944 into a giant radio dish and aimed it at an empty desert 200 million kilometers away. The song was for a robot the size of a golf cart, a machine that had been promised 90 days of life and had instead fought Mars for 15 years. You have probably seen her famous last words. They went around the world and they made millions of people cry over a robot. But what she actually said in her final moments is stranger and sadder than the myth. And the true story of how she lived is even better than the story of how she died. To understand why grown adults wept for a machine, you have to go back to the beginning of this century, when Mars had a reputation as a graveyard. At that point, roughly 2 out of every 3 spacecraft humanity had ever aimed at the red planet had failed. Lost at launch, burned up on arrival, or smashed silently into the surface. NASA's answer to those odds was brutally simple. Build 2 rovers instead of 1, send them to opposite sides of the planet, and hope that at least one survives. The twins were named by Sophie Collis, a 9-year-old girl who had been born in Siberia and adopted from an orphanage, and who wrote in a contest essay that her new life had given her spirit and opportunity. So those became the names, Spirit and Opportunity. Each rover weighed about 180 kilograms and stood roughly as tall as a person, with a camera mast for a head, a robotic arm for a hand, and 2 wide wings of solar panels for a heartbeat. Those panels were also the catch. Martian dust settles on everything, and the engineers calculated that within about 90 Martian days, enough of it would coat the panels to starve the rovers of power. So that became the official mission, 90 days of life and about 600 meters of driving. Privately, the most optimistic people on the team hoped for perhaps twice that. The death sentence was written into the design before either of them ever left Earth. They launched 3 weeks apart in June and July of 2003, racing to catch a window that comes once in a lifetime. That August, Mars passed closer to Earth than it had in nearly 60,000 years. Opportunity spent 7 months falling through the dark, covering 456 million kilometers, with her twin sister 3 weeks ahead of her on the same black road. And on the 25th of January 2004, she hit the top of the Martian atmosphere at almost 20,000 kilometers per hour. There is no gentle way to land on Mars. A heat shield took the fire, a parachute took the scream of the thin air, retro-rockets killed the final fall, and then, wrapped in a cocoon of airbags, Opportunity simply hit the ground and bounced. She bounced more than 24 times, rolling across a flat plane called Meridiani, until physics ran out of arguments, and she came to rest inside a small crater just 22 meters wide. After a journey of 456 million kilometers, she had rolled to a stop inside a hole in the ground, a shot the engineers would forever call the interplanetary hole-in-one. When her first pictures reached Earth, the control room fell silent for a completely different reason. Sitting directly in front of her, close enough to touch, was exposed bedrock. The first bedrock any machine had ever seen up close on Mars, layered like the pages of a book. Scientists had expected to spend their entire 90 days searching for something exactly like this, and she had landed with her wheels practically on top of it. Gravity had simply handed her the jackpot. Within weeks, she found the plane littered with millions of tiny gray spheres, which the team nicknamed blueberries, pellets of hematite, a mineral that on Earth grows in one place only, inside rock soaked in liquid water. The verdict arrived barely 2 months into a 90-day mission, and it rewrote the textbooks. This dead, rust-colored desert had once been wet. An opportunity was standing on the shoreline of a vanished world. And then Sol 90 arrived, the day she was supposed to die. The dust was settling on her panels exactly as predicted, but the planet, it turned out, had a habit nobody had counted on. Small whirlwinds called dust devils wander those plains, and every few months, one of them would sweep directly over Opportunity and scrub her panels clean, as if Mars itself kept wiping the dust from her wings. The engineers began to whisper about bonus time, then to plan for it, then to depend on it. The rover they had built for 90 days quietly refused to stop. Somewhere in those first years, she stopped being hardware. The team called her Oppy, they called her She, and they came in on weekends to check on her the way you check on family. Which is exactly why the spring of 2005 hit them so hard, when Mars decided to remind everyone who was really in charge. Driving across a field of wind-blown ripples, Opportunity broke through the crust of an innocent-looking dune and buried herself up to the hubs in powder-fine sand. She was 450 million kilometers from the nearest tow truck. For 5 weeks she sat trapped, while engineers on Earth rebuilt that dune grain by grain in a sandbox at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, rehearsing every possible escape with a twin rover before daring to move the real one. When the commands finally went up, her 6 wheels turned through the equivalent of nearly 200 meters of driving just to claw forward a single meter. Centimeter by centimeter, day after day, she dragged herself out of the trap the team had named Purgatory Dune. The lesson was carved into every drive plan that followed. On Mars, even the ground itself is trying to kill you. And from that day on, ripple fields like it were marked on the maps as places you simply do not go. The years that followed turned her into an explorer no one had dared to imagine. She rolled past the twisted wreckage of her own discarded heat shield, and beside it, half buried in the sand, she found a pitted lump of iron the size of a basketball. The first meteorite ever discovered on the surface of another planet. She spent almost 2 years at a crater called Victoria, 800 meters wide, circling its scalloped rim before descending inside, knowing full well she might never climb back out. And then climbing back out anyway, up her own wheel tracks. Then, in the summer of 2007, the sky itself turned against her. A dust storm swelled until it wrapped around the entire planet, and above Meridiani, the sunlight dimmed to less than 1% of normal. Opportunity's daily energy collapsed from roughly 700 watt-hours to just 128. Not enough to drive, barely enough to keep her electronics from freezing in nights that fell below -90 degrees Celsius. For weeks she huddled in low-power silence, forbidden even from calling home too often, because every word to Earth cost energy she no longer had. The team could do nothing but wait and run the numbers on her dying batteries and hope. Then the storm faded, the dust devils returned to clean her wings, and she simply drove on. Remember this moment, because she had now survived a global dust storm, and everyone knew it. 11 years later, that memory would become the cruelest kind of hope. Her twin, on the far side of the planet, was never given that kind of luck. Spirit had drawn the harder ground from the very beginning, and her story became a catalog of narrow escapes. A computer breakdown in her 3rd week that nearly ended the mission, and then a failed wheel that she dragged behind her for years like a wounded leg. In May of 2009, that dragging wheel broke through a fragile crust into a hidden pocket of soft sulfate sand. And this time, no sandbox on Earth could find a way out. Spirit faced the Martian winter tilted away from the sun, unable to charge her batteries. And on the 22nd of March 2010, she sent her last signal and went quiet forever. NASA kept calling her name for more than a year before finally letting go. And for the first time since Florida, Opportunity was alone on Mars. By her 10th year, Opportunity was an old machine, and she aged the way people age. Her flash memory began to fail, so some mornings she woke up having forgotten everything she had done the day before. The team called them amnesia events, and they learned to work with a rover that could no longer trust her own memories, sending her a day's work each morning, then begging her to radio the results home by nightfall before sleep could steal them. A joint in her robotic arm stiffened and seized. A heater refused to switch off and leaked precious power every single day. And one of her front wheels began drawing too much current, so for years she drove backwards to spare it, reversing her way across an entire planet. None of it stopped her, and the odometer kept climbing through numbers no one had ever written into a plan. In March of 2015, 11 years and 2 months into a 90-day mission, she rolled past 42.2 kilometers. A marathon, completed for the first time in history beyond Earth. It remains the slowest marathon ever run, and arguably the greatest. At the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, her operators celebrated by running a relay marathon of their own, carrying a baton for a runner 200 million kilometers away. And the destination was worth every year of the road. In 2011, after a 3-year trek across the plains that her drivers described like an ocean crossing, she had reached the rim of Endeavour, a crater 22 kilometers wide, where the exposed rocks were older than anything any rover had ever touched. There she found a bright vein of gypsum squeezed into a fracture in the bedrock, a mineral that forms in exactly one way, from water flowing through stone. And nearby she found ancient clays of a kind that can only be born in water that is neither acid nor brine, but neutral. Water, in other words, that a human being could have safely drunk. This was her deepest discovery, and it changed the question entirely. Mars had not merely been wet. Young Mars had been habitable, with lakes and groundwater gentle enough for life as we know it. In 2017, she arrived at the head of a shallow channel carved down the inner slope of Endeavour's rim, a groove that looked like it had been cut by flowing water billions of years ago. Mission planners had already given the place a name, Perseverance Valley. She began working her way down it, image by image, stone by stone, and she would never leave. The rover that outlasted every promise had come to die in a valley called Perseverance. On the 30th of May, 2018, a camera in orbit noticed a small dust storm brewing about 1,000 kilometers from her position. Local storms like it flare up every Martian year, and she had outlived dozens of them, so the first reports read like routine weather. Within a week, it was clear that this one was something else entirely. The storm exploded across the planet faster than any on record, and by the middle of June, it had swallowed Mars whole. A single storm wrapping an entire world. Scientists measure dust in the Martian sky with a number called tau, where 1 is a hazy afternoon and 5 is the worst that Opportunity had ever endured. Above Perseverance Valley, tau climbed past 10.8, the thickest, darkest sky ever measured on the surface of Mars. At noon, the valley went as black as night, and the sun simply disappeared. Opportunity ran on sunlight, and the sunlight was gone. On the 10th of June, 2018, she called home one last time. Her message was telemetry, plain engineering numbers, and the numbers said this. Her energy for the day had fallen to 22 watt-hours, roughly enough to run a single light bulb for 20 minutes, and the darkness above her had gone beyond anything she had ever measured. Her power was low, and her sky was getting dark. Then the signal ended, and the storm closed over her like a tide. Months later, a science journalist would compress that final telemetry into one human sentence. "My battery is low and it's getting dark." And that sentence would circle the globe, printed on posters and murals, making strangers cry on trains over a robot they had never met. Purists will tell you she never actually said those words, and technically they are right, because she sent data, not poetry. But the data meant exactly that. The translation was not a lie. It was the moment millions of people suddenly understood, all at once, what the numbers had been quietly saying. The storm raged for weeks, and the sky did not fully clear until September. Then began one of the most stubborn vigils in the history of spaceflight. Day after day, the team beamed commands toward Perseverance Valley and listened through the static for the faintest reply, hoping her batteries had survived the cold, hoping the coming windy season would scrub her panels the way it had 100 times before. She had survived a global storm once, and hope has a very long memory. They called the search sweep and beep. Transmit, then listen, then move the antenna, then listen again. And over 8 months they sent more than 1,000 recovery commands, trying every frequency, every contingency in the book, and several that were invented on the spot for a dying rover. Every morning of that vigil, the team opened their shift by playing her a wake-up song in the control room. Songs about sunshine, songs about waking up, songs about coming home. A new one every single day for month after month. And Mars answered with nothing but silence. By February of 2019, the windy season had come and gone, and the silence had stretched past 8 months. On the evening of the 12th, the team gathered in Mission Control for one final session, the room where our story began. They transmitted their last set of commands, knowing they were almost certainly speaking to no one. And then, because engineers are human beings, they chose one last wake-up song. It was Billie Holiday's wartime recording of "I'll Be Seeing You," a promise from the 1940s to find the one you love again in every familiar place. The next morning, NASA declared the mission complete. A machine warranted for 90 days had worked for 5,111. She outlived her own death sentence more than 50 times over. And grown adults stood in a control room in California and wept for a robot on another planet. Opportunity drove 45.16 kilometers across Mars, farther than any machine has ever driven on the surface of another world, a record that still stands today. But records in this business are simply mile markers left behind for whoever comes next. Just last month, in June of 2026, her successor, Perseverance, completed its own Martian marathon in less than half the time she needed, and every headline that celebrated the achievement measured the new rover against Oppy. Sometime in the next few years, her distance record will finally fall, and the people who once drove her will smile when it happens, because passing the baton is precisely what she was for. Her discoveries rewrote an entire planet, turning Mars from a dead red rock into a world that once had rain, rivers, and water you could drink. And more than 217,000 of her photographs are still being studied right now. And she is still there, standing in Perseverance Valley with dust on her wings, facing a horizon she never reached. One day, decades from now, a human being in a suit will walk down that valley, kneel beside her, and brush the dust from her solar panels with a gloved hand. And then she will go home, to a museum, where children will press their faces to the glass in front of the little machine that was promised 90 days and gave the world 15 years. Her twin deserves the same honor. Spirit's story, the rover that drew every short straw, dragged a broken wheel across half a planet, and died fighting, trapped in the sand as the winter closed in, is a very different kind of heartbreak, and it is coming next on this channel. Subscribe now so that you don't miss her. Because Mars is a graveyard of machines, but some of them refuse to be forgotten.